This is Stratford upon Avon, in the heartland of the English countryside. And you don't have to wander very far to realise that this attractive black and white Tudor town fathered a very famous son. William Shakespeare, undoubtedly the world's best known playwright, was born here more than 400 years ago. There are statues and memorials wherever you look, ranging from the magnificent Royal Shakespeare Theatre to museums, gift shops, tea houses and gardens, all claiming an intimate connection with Stratford's greatest and most lucrative treasure. Love him or hate him, whether you're an ardent theatre-goer or a reluctant student forced to study the ubiquitous Bard's many plays and poems, the truth is simple. Shakespeare is impossible to ignore. In his own time, Shakespeare certainly received a mixed press at first, seemingly delighting and disgusting by equal measure with a lifestyle, despite historic details being at best scanty in places, that was as fantastic and, for some, as unbelievable as the complex dramatic twists and turns of his plays. There are many popular snippets of Shakespeare quoted in the modern world. To be or not to be, and Alas, poor Yorick, from Hamlet. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, much satirised from Julius Caesar. A horse, my kingdom for a horse! The desperate cry of Richard III, literally looking for a horse. And of course, Juliet's forlorn, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? That's in point of fact not a query as to her beloved's whereabouts. She's just wishing he had a different name. Needless to say, much misquotation and the removal of lines completely out of context has taken place with the passage of time. But to start this programme, one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches, tucked elusively away in his play As You Like It, will set the scene for this incredible journey into Shakespeare Country.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his act being 7 ages. At first, the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face creeping like a snail.
So let's begin with Shakespeare's first age and his own arrival into the world. Stepping back so far in history to a time when official records were few, it's difficult to be absolutely sure about anything that happened in Shakespeare's life. However, one of the few indisputable facts is that Mary Arden was Shakespeare's mother, and for many people visiting Stratford, the Arden family house, reputed to have been her home before she married John Shakespeare, is one of the highlights of any tour. This lovely, half-timbered 16th century farmhouse is in the picturesque village of Wilmcote, just a few miles to the northwest of Stratford. Mary Arden's house, as it's always been very fondly known, in Featherbed Lane, has become a veritable mecca for Shakespeare pilgrims. But it's in fact the house next door, Glebe Farm, that is today recognised as being where she actually lived. Both houses are open to the public and part of a superb countryside museum complex which is well worth a visit. There's also a falconry centre on the site with a wide range of species in residence appearing in regular flying displays. The Ardens were a prosperous Warwickshire farming family, Mary being the youngest of 8 daughters, and her choice of John Shakespeare is an interesting one. John Shakespeare was the son of one of the Ardens' tenants, and the family had, to say the least, a colourful reputation. John was working in Stratford as a glovemaker. However, there's early documentation of his wayward behaviour, as on the 29th of April 1552 he was fined 1 shilling for making a midden, more accurately a dung heap, outside the house of his neighbour in Henley Street, who complained vociferously. Without the benefits of flushing toilets or effective plumbing of any description, Tudor streets were very smelly, and each road had an allocated communal muck hill. Anyone too lazy to deposit their waste appropriately was fined heavily, especially when the offending pile was left to fester outside someone else's house. Apart from being extremely antisocial, it was a terrible health hazard at a time when plague was rife and life expectancy minimal. It was said that the Shakespeare family was famous for never paying a debt until severely pressed to do so. But in this instance, John Shakespeare broke with tradition and paid his fine promptly, evidently with a view to social advancement, despite his rather messy indiscretion. His choice of Mary Arden as a bride was also to his civic advantage, she being much above his station in life, and the two were married towards the end of 1557. It's most likely that the wedding took place here in the parish church of St. John the Baptist, Aston Cantlow, where Mary would probably have been christened many years earlier. Unfortunately, no register was kept at the time, although parish records did begin just a few years later, so there's no absolute proof or precise dates for this event. William Shakespeare's birth is said to have taken place here at John Shakespeare's Henley Street home on the 23rd of April 1564, known throughout England as St. George's Day, he of the dragon-slaying fame since 1222. There are 2 areas of debate here. Firstly, there's no actual proof that this was the place of Shakespeare's birth, although it certainly was his home and remained within the family until 1806. In 1847, it was bought by the Birthplace Trust, which still administers the building to this day. Restoration began in 1857 and was a fine example of early architectural preservation. Unfortunately, previous to this, a most unscrupulous character named Mrs. Hornby ran the establishment, and visitors who paid her handsomely were permitted to carve a chunk from Shakespeare's chair as a souvenir. Also, during later years, the world-famous Shakespearean actors Henry Irving and Ellen Terry scratched their names into the latticed windows, as had the great author Sir Walter Scott before them. However, even the most illustrious of modern visitor, no matter what their literary credentials, would never be allowed to commit such acts of vandalism today. The second debatable point is the precise date of Shakespeare's birth. This is Holy Trinity Church, where Shakespeare is buried, and a simple gravestone shows that the date of his death was on the same day as his supposed birth, the 23rd of April, 1616. For the growing Shakespeare industry that flourished after he'd breathed his last, the irony of the great man's birth and death being on the same day, and better still, on the feast of St. George, the patron saint of England, was just too good a publicity stunt to miss out on. It's far more likely that Shakespeare was born a few days earlier, in April, as he was christened on the 26th of April, which, if a St. George's Day arrival is to be believed, would have been 3 days later. In the 16th century, a christening so soon after a birth would usually only have happened if the baby's life was in danger. So sadly, as romantic as Shakespeare's given dates may sound, the reality might have been rather more mundane. William Shakespeare was the third child of Mary and John. But unlike the two sisters who'd preceded him and died in infancy, he survived into childhood, growing to become a whining schoolboy, entering his second age. William Shakespeare was classed by a number of his contemporaries as uneducated, and even his good friend and fellow playwright Ben Jonson described him as having small Latin and less Greek. Nevertheless, he did go to school, and for the upwardly mobile, aspiring John Shakespeare, already well on his way to becoming Mayor of Stratford, the King's New School, also known as Stratford Grammar School, was the only option that could have been chosen for his son William, possibly from as young an age as 5. When you consider what life was like for a young Tudor schoolboy, it's easy to understand why an older and wiser Shakespeare paints his picture of a reluctant recipient of education. Typically, the school day ran from 6 in the morning until 6 at night. Lessons were a mixture of religious doctrine and the classics, with masters of repute but little inspiration. Not only were the long days tedious, the boys were also beaten for the slightest misdemeanour or rule-breaking. It's well worth taking a walk past the Guild Chapel, Guildhall and Grammar School in Stratford's Church Street today, just a short stroll from Shakespeare's boyhood home in Henley Street. The almshouses have been preserved with the greatest of care, and the long terrace is perfectly intact. Time now to return to Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man, before exploring the next stage in William's development.
And then the lover, sighing like furnace with a woeful ballad, made to his mistress' eyebrow. Then a soldier, full of strange oaths, and bearded like the pard, jealous in honour, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth.
There's no official record of Shakespeare's entry into Stratford Grammar School or of his leaving, but it's generally accepted that this was where he was educated. Most boys would leave at the age of 15 to either start earning their livings, or the few that were very fortunate went on to university. By the time William reached the age of 13, his father's business dealings and grand social standing had fallen into decline, and Shakespeare's formal education came to an abrupt end. Many suggestions have been made as to the work that Shakespeare turned his hand to, ranging from the probable, helping his family in the family glove-making business, through to the fanciful, namely running away to sea aboard Sir Francis Drake's Golden Hind. He might literally have been a butcher, a baker, or candlestick maker. The truth is, nobody will ever know for sure. And so to Shakespeare the lover. Were his early amorous experiences akin to the youthful Romeo's, with passion burning hot for his lady? Sadly for Shakespeare, it would appear not to have been the case, as the young William fell into the trap that many a good-looking lad before and since has fallen into. This irresistible thatched property, now belonging to Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust, at Shottery, is known the world over as Anne Hathaway's cottage, the family home of Shakespeare's wife. The romantic guidebooks would have you believe that William regularly walked these pathways to court his lady love, but sadly for Shakespeare, the few facts that exist suggest it was a far from satisfactory liaison. Anne Hathaway was 8 years Shakespeare's senior, and when he was just 18, he was undoubtedly pressured into marrying her, having been named as the father of the child she was expecting. Anne's father had recently died, and 2 of his friends obtained a special licence, having pledged the then huge sum of £40 to guarantee the wedding would take place. As Shakespeare was not of age and his prospective wife was already pregnant, the matter had to be approved by the highest church authorities in the area, and evidently the supporters of Miss Hathaway were determined that young Shakespeare would do the right thing by her, whatever his own views on the matter might be. By the time Shakespeare was 19, his wife had produced a daughter, Susanna, christened in May 1583. Unable to afford a home of their own, the new family moved in with Shakespeare's parents in Henley Street. 2 years later, Anne bore William twins, Hamnet and Judith, named after Hamnet and Judith Sadler, friends of the couple who lived close by on the corner of High Street and Sheep Street in Stratford, who incidentally named their own son William to return the compliment. These were not good years for William Shakespeare, and although we can only guess at what life was like in this house, overcrowded with children and mundane domestic occupation, there was at least some small compensation for the young father forced to face his responsibilities. Stratford had become a popular venue for travelling players, with the Guildhall used by troupes of actors to put on various plays. Perhaps it was here that William Shakespeare was first inspired to think of the theatre as a future career, and, even better, a means of escaping the drudgery of domesticity. There are two events that may have hastened Shakespeare to remove himself from Stratford and try his luck in London at this time. The first of the two suggested happenings involves the deer that can still be seen at Charlecote Park, just a few miles from Stratford today. Sir Thomas Lacey, Lord of the Manor and local magistrate, had built Charlecote Park, a stately Tudor residence in honour of Queen Elizabeth I. It's a long-standing tradition that William Shakespeare was a frequent poacher of deer here, and he was caught one night in the act purloining a fine specimen from his lordship's deer herd. Unfortunately, when he was hauled before the magistrate to face the consequences of his crime, William Shakespeare was presented before Sir Thomas Lacey himself, and by all accounts the wronged gentleman took a great dislike to the offender and persecuted William with a vengeance from this point on. The second event that may have coincided with Shakespeare's desire to escape the clutches of Sir Thomas Lacey came with a visit by the Queen's Men, one of the major theatre companies of the day, to Stratford when Shakespeare would have been 23. The Queen's Men had been performing near Oxford before their arrival in Stratford, and there'd been a near riot as people clamoured to see them. It was in this highly charged atmosphere that two actors got into a drunken brawl, with the tragic consequences that one of them was killed. The survivor pleaded self-defence and was pardoned by Queen Elizabeth herself, and the troupe moved on to Stratford, a man short. Although the question is purely speculative, it has to be asked whether young William Shakespeare seized the moment and volunteered to step into the dead man's shoes. It's certainly a feasible theory, as within a few short years William Shakespeare disappeared from Stratford and reappeared on the London theatre scene. What better opportunity could Shakespeare have had to get to London than by hitching a ride with a group of travelling players, and what better apprenticeship would have been available to a future playwright? The last record of Shakespeare in Stratford is the baptism of his twins in February 1585, after which time it's generally accepted that he went to London, working his way around various theatre companies. The first reference made to Shakespeare as an actor and playwright came in 1592, in Green's Groatsworth of Wit, bought with 1,000,000 of repentance. Shakespeare scholars often refer to the period between 1585 and 1592 as the lost years. And although for the purposes of this programme we've made an educated guess as to the likely progress of Shakespeare's life, it is just that, no more, no less. Richard Green, the author of the article in question, was a university-educated playwright who took a very dim view of an untrained country actor trying his hand at theatrical authorship. Green describes Shakespeare as an upstart crow, who supposes that he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the next man. Evidently, Shakespeare had a full-scale battle ahead of him with the established theatrical world, and just as in his 7 Ages of Man, he had to turn soldier, if only metaphorically, to establish his credentials in the city that would quite literally prove for Shakespeare to be paved with gold. It's quite tricky to actually date the plays of William Shakespeare, as they were published by way of performance and didn't appear together in printed format until some 7 years after Shakespeare's death. However, it was recorded that Shakespeare bought shares in a theatrical company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men in 1594, by which time at least 6 of his plays had been produced. Shakespeare remained a leading member of this group for the rest of his career, although when Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603 and King James I succeeded her, they were renamed the King's Men, making regular Royal Command performances. The young man who'd left Stratford upon Avon in such a hurry to escape domesticity, a wife he blatantly didn't like, and the wrath of the local landowner, had made quite a name for himself in London, and not only because of his plays. If Warwickshire and his early marriage to Anne Hathaway had stifled his amorous nature, literary success and the loose morals of London artistes allowed him the freedom to experiment every which way. It's well known that there was a dark-eyed beauty that captured William Shakespeare's heart, and there are numerous references to her in his plays and poems that generations of Shakespeare students have uncovered through the ages. There's even talk that the great bard was bisexual, and without doubt, on a number of occasions, the medical doctors of the nation's capital had to prescribe noxious treatments for some very antisocial, sexually transmitted diseases. Perhaps it's as well Mrs. William Shakespeare was tucked well away in the Warwickshire countryside, as she most definitely would not have approved of her husband's many infidelities. Who could say what gossip reached the ears of Shakespeare's family in Stratford? And as the children grew up, you can only ponder what kind of influence the increasingly successful playwright had upon them, or indeed, how often he even visited. When tragedy struck, however, with the death of Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, at the age of 11, he would undoubtedly have returned to bury the unfortunate boy. It's thanks to Shakespeare's plays that we know how distraught William the father was at the loss of his son. There's no record of what killed Hamnet, whether illness or accident, but sadly it meant the end of the Shakespeare name for this particular branch of the family, as the playwright's other children were both girls, and his 3 brothers died without issue. In one of Shakespeare's lesser-known plays, King John, a mother supposes her young son has been killed, and her lines echo Shakespeare's own personal sadness.
Grief fills up the room of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me all of his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form.
It may well have seemed little consolation at the time, but at least by this stage in William Shakespeare's life, he'd not only received popular acclaim for his writing, he'd also become rich and prosperous. Despite a hectic, exciting and successful way of life in London, William Shakespeare was evidently still a Stratford man at heart, choosing to invest the majority of his money in the region of his birth. A year after Hamlet Shakespeare's death, William made a significant purchase in Stratford that left the good townsfolk in no doubt whatsoever about the ascending fortunes of the young tearaway who'd fled Stratford so many years earlier. This wonderful black and white property, known as Nash's House, was bought by the Birthplace Trust in 1862 and was completely restored in the early 1900s. At first glance, the link to Shakespeare may seem a little tenuous, this having been the home of the Bard's granddaughter Elizabeth, who'd married the lawyer Thomas Nash, after whom the house was named in 1626. However fascinating the house might be, it's actually the area covered by the gardens that is of significant interest here. On this site stood New Place, one of the finest houses in Stratford upon Avon, built by Sir Hugh Clopton in around 1480, builder of the famous bridge into the town. Apart from a few foundations and a couple of wells, nothing of the great house that accommodated royalty on many occasions remains. Shakespeare bought the house for a bargain price, and his family were installed in style. The destruction of this great national treasure came in the 18th century, when the Reverend Francis Gastrell of Cheshire purchased the property as a summer house. Shakespeare's association with New Place was well known, and visitors came from far and wide to see where the famous Bard of Avon had lived, much to the annoyance of the new owner. The most common request was for a viewing of the mulberry tree that Shakespeare was reputed to have planted in the garden. But to prevent such unwelcome intrusions continuing, the reverend gentleman cut the tree down. Perhaps this should have served as a warning to the local tax officials who were battling with the Reverend Gastrell to increase the rates on New Place. Rather than enter into negotiations, he refused to even allow officials to cross his threshold, committing a perfectly legal but appalling act of vandalism by demolishing the house completely. It's said that the Great Garden, which was renovated in Tudor style after World War I, contains a mulberry tree that supposedly came from the Shakespearean original. Whether this is true or not, it's impossible to say. But this is a beautiful garden, and well worth a few moments of anyone's time on a visit to Stratford. William Shakespeare had definitely made a name for himself and moved stylishly into the next of his 7 ages: successful, worldly wise and respected not only in the place of his birth, but also in the nation's capital, London.
And then the justice, in fair round belly, with good capon lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part.
One of the things that you'll probably have realised by now is that whenever Shakespeare was involved in things, nothing was ever quite as straightforward as it might at first seem. This is most definitely true of the Globe Theatre, which came into being throughout the first 6 months of 1599. Today, a detailed reproduction of this Elizabethan playhouse stands on almost the exact same spot as Shakespeare's Wooden O, as he was fond of describing the Globe. Constructed from wood, there was no roof, which meant that this was definitely a summer venue, and even then, in instances of bad weather, performances had to be cancelled. The Globe was built when Shakespeare's company, still then the Lord Chamberlain's Men, needed a new theatre, as their existing one had come to the end of its 21-year lease. Now a famous company, thanks to Shakespeare's literary efforts, the landlord demanded an exorbitant rent from the successful troupe of actors, and after what ran into years of negotiation, he finally threatened to pull the theatre down if they didn't give him his cut of the action. Rather than helping his cause, the landlord had actually shot himself in the foot, as he gave the sharp-witted bunch of thespians a very good idea. It was in fact their building, and only the ground it stood upon belonged to the landlord, so a cunning plan was quickly hatched. At the dead of night, the conspirators worthy of any Shakespearean plot dismantled the old theatre plank by plank and ferried the contentious cargo across the River Thames to a new site, where the Globe soon became one of Elizabethan London's most famous landmarks. With masterpieces such as Hamlet and Twelfth Night on offer at the Globe in the early years, the playgoing folk of the nation's capital flocked to see the works of William Shakespeare. Also, Queen Elizabeth I enjoyed many command performances of Shakespeare's plays, and her royal seal of approval certainly helped to promote even greater success. However, there were occasions when Shakespeare took risks, writing about topical political issues at a time when displeasing the Queen could cost you your life. Certain scenes that he penned were omitted during Elizabeth's lifetime. The deposition of a weak monarch in his historical play Richard II would undoubtedly have caused considerable offence. Here, Shakespeare was in point of fact questioning the divine right of kingship, the God-given right of the royal family's line of succession, something that Queen Elizabeth might well have interpreted as being tantamount to treason. Fortunately, Shakespeare was wise enough to avoid being sent to the Tower of London, keeping his head to write another day. And, interestingly, when Queen Elizabeth died and her nephew King James VI of Scotland acceded to the throne, Shakespeare even went out of his way to write plays that would please the new monarch. Macbeth took a complete reworking of Scottish historical fact to boost the already enormous royal ego, and as well as flattering the new king's dubious lineage, Shakespeare also kept the play very short, about half the length of his usual literary offerings, in keeping with King James's preferences. Ironically, the Globe today stands just a stone's throw from Southwark Cathedral, where a real-life Shakespearean tragedy is commemorated. Naturally, being in such close proximity to the Globe, Southwark Cathedral has many memorials to William, the great Bard of Avon, but Edmund, one of Shakespeare's younger brothers, is actually buried here. Despite such seemingly advantageous dynastic connections, the unfortunate Edmund failed to make a success of his acting career, and at the age of 27 he died having only reached the paltry rank of a travelling player. Shakespeare continued to pen his plays, much to the delight of his audiences, with King Lear, Macbeth and Othello, but by the time he was approaching his half-century, much of the magic had gone. After collaborating with fellow playwright John Fletcher to compose his last two works, Shakespeare finally set down his quill, and by his 50th birthday in April 1614, he retired to Stratford as his health began to fail. Whatever Shakespeare's shortcomings as a husband and father down the years, and if you listen to the only partially exaggerated gossip about his hedonistic London life, he had provided for his family financially in some style. As if in return for her father's monetary efforts, Shakespeare's elder daughter, Susanna, had made very appropriate provision for her father's old age, having some years earlier married John Hall, the finest doctor in Stratford upon Avon. Whilst finally Shakespeare took up permanent residence in his grand New Place house, Susanna and the good doctor lived at Hall's Croft, just a short distance away. This lovely 16th century house was much enlarged and improved by the prosperous Halls, and having been purchased by the Birthplace Trust in 1949, it is today open to the many Shakespearean disciples who make their way to this significant Tudor building. No matter how good a physician Dr. John Hall was, Shakespeare, with his fondness for fine ale and lively company, was never going to be an easy patient to minister to. Also, Shakespeare had written his 7 Ages of Man while in his 30s, and he must by this time have been harbouring real concerns that his predicted definition of old age might turn out in fact to be his own final lot.
The 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose well saved a world too wide for his shrunk shank and his big manly voice. Turning again towards childish treble, pipes and whistles his sound. Last scene of all that ends this strange eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything.
Not that Shakespeare's allotted time on earth was going to permit him to reach the 7th age, as death would prevent him from reaching any second childhood. '16 was not a good year for the Shakespeares of Stratford, despite William's prosperous retirement. Judith, Shakespeare's younger daughter, married wine merchant Thomas Quinney at Holy Trinity Church on the 10th of February. Just days before the wedding news broke that the groom was expecting a child with another woman, certainly giving the gossip mongers of Stratford something to talk about. Somewhat surprisingly, the wedding went ahead as planned, but within the month the poor woman in question had died in childbirth, the baby perishing also. A bitter beginning to Judith's married life, but the actual day itself was to precipitate yet another tragedy. Amongst the dignitaries of Stratford invited to the wedding, Shakespeare had a merry meeting with a number of old friends, including Ben Jonson, perhaps the closest Shakespeare ever came to having a literary rival, but who he'd grown extremely fond of during his lifetime. Ben Jonson spurred Shakespeare on to enjoy too much Rhenish wine, and a jolly drunken time was allegedly had by all. It's also claimed that Shakespeare partook of rather more pickled herrings than were good for him, and by the next day it was evident that Shakespeare was suffering from far more than a hangover. Unfortunately, he quickly became feverish and never recovered. Deterioration was rapid, and despite Dr. John Hall's most efficacious pills and potions, William Shakespeare died on the 23rd of April, St. George's Day, 1616, if legend is to be believed, his 52nd birthday. Shakespeare's remains were returned to Holy Trinity Church for burial, where the great bard's own words on his gravestone defy anyone to ever disturb him from his eternal rest.
Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be ye man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones.
This was a fine epitaph for a man who, despite spending most of his life away from Stratford, always considered the lovely town of his birth to be his home. There's just one last piece of writing by Shakespeare, this time of a very personal nature, that has given scholars of the great bard much to discuss over the centuries. Although Shakespeare altered his will a matter of weeks before his death, it was far more likely to have been a response to Judith's marriage rather than a premonition of his own imminent death. An astute father, Shakespeare had realised that Quinney was a bad lot, and he made provision for Judith and any children she might have to be protected away from the clutches of Quinney. All Judith's children died before she did, and this branch of the Shakespeare family ended with her death at the remarkably old age of 77 in 1662. New Place and the bulk of Shakespeare's estate went to elder daughter Susanna, with the unwritten proviso that she was to care for her mother for the rest of her days. There's an interesting legacy left to his wife Anne that centuries of critics have interpreted as a last insult for the wife he hated. In his own words, he gave unto his wife his second best bed, a snub indeed when taken out of context. Ironically, in Shakespeare's day, families of his high social class and standing would have kept the best bed in the house for guests, so in fact he may well have been leaving Anne their marital bed, which in turn was possibly her parents' bed from the lovely thatched cottage she grew up in. Consequently, Shakespeare may have been misjudged on this count, as his legacy was perhaps a touching tribute to the woman who had single-handedly brought up his children in both poverty and prosperity. Susanna and Dr. John Hall's only daughter Elizabeth, despite 2 marriages, failed to produce any issue, and so the direct, legitimate bloodline of William Shakespeare died with his granddaughter in 1670. But however bereft of descendants William Shakespeare was, his progeny of literary offspring have certainly represented him well down through the years to the present day. Often the plays are split into 3 categories. Firstly, the histories, such as Henry IV and Richard II, inspired by the real kings of England, whose stories are told in poetic verse. Secondly, the comedies, although often humorous, are perhaps best known as the plays which have happy endings, such as Twelfth Night, As You Like It, and the appropriately named All's Well That Ends Well. In contrast, and lastly, come the tragedies, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet and Macbeth being prime examples, with outcomes being far from joyous. Shakespeare is credited with having written at least 37 plays, and a whole array of poetry and sonnets into the bargain. As this tour of Shakespeare Country draws to an end, stop and take a last look at the classic Warwickshire locations that inspired William Shakespeare to take up his quill and write. The rolling green landscape of Middle England was of vital strategic importance in Shakespeare's day, and the great castles of Warwick and nearby Kenilworth still stand, the epitome of the Warwickshire that the Bard of Avon knew. Here at Edge Hill, just a few miles southeast of Stratford, the very first battle of the English Civil War was fought between Oliver Cromwell's Roundheads and King Charles I's Cavaliers, only 26 years after Shakespeare's death in 1616. It's a location that Shakespeare would have known well, proving the dramatic potential of this very special central region of the English countryside. Within a few miles, you'll find an ancient relic called the King's Stone, where a would-be ruler of England attempted to gain control over the land, knowing this country to be the key to the kingdom. A failure to respect local custom as he crossed the path of an old hag of a witch resulted in him being turned to stone, a salutary warning to future travellers scornful of the importance of this most particular rural landscape. Although Shakespeare's success came from years spent in London, the nation's capital, it was Stratford upon Avon, town of his birth, and the surrounding countryside that shaped his incredible literary talent. There are still those even today that question whether Stratford's most famous son could possibly have written to such a high standard. How could a provincial reprobate with little education have possibly put such eloquent words into the mouths of such fascinating characters? Dissenting voices lie quiet when you wander through Shakespeare Country, and if you let your imagination loose, it's truly amazing just how close you can get to the real landscape that spawned the talent of William Shakespeare, perhaps the greatest literary genius of all time.